Okay, in this lecture, we get to talk about common processes of aging. There are enough of these, and I think it takes enough time that I split it into two parts, with the second part being covered during the second week of the class. And so today, the parts we're going to talk about here are free radicals, inflammation, advanced glycation end products, a really fancy name there, and then atherosclerosis. So we're going to start with free radicals. We mentioned this under the accumulated damage theory of aging, where free radicals are going to accumulate damage over the time. And I said it was one of the ones that I gave a lot of credence to. And here we get to define them and talk about them a little bit more. What is a free radical? Well, it could be an atom, a molecule, an ion, but it has an unpaired electron. And that unpaired electron makes it highly unstable. And that lack of stability, it wants to go around and bind and interact with other things. And what it ends up doing is oxidizing them. It reacts to them and oxidizes them. This is actually the same process as happens with metal and rust, is that rust gets oxidized. Well, these free radicals, some of the common ones, this isn't an exhaustive list, but superoxide anion. So this is oxide, so made from oxygen, again with an unpaired electron. As oxygen goes, I'll talk about it in a moment. I'm actually getting ahead of myself. But remember, for those who don't remember the biology, there's the electron transport chain that takes place on the inner mitochondrial membrane. And as part of that electron transport chain, electrons are passed around. Well, what if one of those electrons got away? Well, oxygen is sitting right there, because remember, oxygen is the last electron, or the last acceptor. Well, sometimes the electron gets out there and the result is superoxide anion. And again, that's happening in the mitochondria. Remember we mentioned free radicals are formed primarily in the mitochondria. It's the site of production. See, there's our hydroxyl free radicals. So this is OH negative with an unpaired electron. Nitric oxide, they've found as well. You may not be familiar with this. NO, it's actually a common signaling molecule in the body. And again, these are highly reactive. They oxidize other molecules, and in the process, they can damage those molecules. Well, if you damage a protein, eventually proteins are replaced, and so they'll be okay. You can even oxidize fats, and yeah, well, eventually they'll be okay. But what if you oxidize DNA, and it damages the DNA, and now you copy the DNA, and it has that damage in it, and so it gets passed on to future cells. This is where the problems start to arrive, okay? So here's how they're formed, primarily through metabolism, through our own metabolism. Again, I just mentioned it takes place in the mitochondria, where ATP is produced because electrons leak from the electron transport chain and they reduce other molecules. And then that molecule in turn oxidizes another molecule. But free radicals are actually also part of common signaling pathways that we use every day. These are called redox reactions. For those who are familiar with that, that's oxidation reduction. And so free radicals are actually necessary. They're used extensively in the immune system. And so they are important as well. So we can't just all of a sudden try and stop all free radicals. Well, we use some of them, and the rest are damaging us. If you could select which ones, you might have a good way to slow down aging. Free radicals are also produced when we break down waste products, or it says here, toxic substances such as alcohol. Yeah, we drink alcohol, but technically to our body, alcohol is a toxin. And our bodies treat it as such. And whenever we have some of these toxins that we take in, the liver and then some other organs that are involved with maybe breaking them down will produce free radicals. Cigarette smoke contains free radicals that go into our body. And then it also contains something else we'll talk about in a moment that will produce more free radicals. Cigarette smoke can do a lot with free radicals. A quick story, one of my former colleagues who has since retired, in his early days of his career, he worked as a research scientist with one of the large tobacco companies. And he was studying free radicals. I can't remember his reasons, but one day he took his cigarette. He was a heavy smoker, and he put his cigarette in the liquid where they're measuring free radicals, and they were doing this by this, they would produce some light. He said it lit up like fireworks just because he put a cigarette in there. So many free radicals. That's the day he stopped smoking. He understood them enough that that's what that was important for him. Radiation, remember the radiation under the accumulated damage theories of aging, but I said a lot of these theories really interact. Well, here's where they're interacting, because radiation can also cause free radicals. We don't get a lot of internal radiation, although we can through X-rays or even cosmic rays. But we do are exposed to, our skin is exposed to sunlight, and that radiation causes free radicals and can damage the DNA in our skin a lot more. Well, what is it that makes these so dangerous? The fact that when we're oxidizing these other molecules, we change their shape, we change their function. It can cause mutations of DNA. It induces something called oxidative damage, and I'm going to bold that here because that's a term we use in some other places. This oxidative damage can accumulate over a long period of time. In addition, free radicals also cause formation of something called the reactive oxygen species, which you'll most commonly see as this abbreviation here, ROS, R-O-S. And these reactive oxygen species, and I'll go through this example list here in just a moment, they can also then cause additional damage. So if radicals damage, they cause more, and then they produce other molecules which will cause more damage. Some of the most common reactive oxygen species, hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, you can go buy it at the store. You can treat cuts and wounds with it. That's because it's killing bacteria in the same way that it would be harmful for other cells. Peroxynitrite, normal reactive oxygen species function. Again, immune system uses these pathways all the time. That's how we can kill some of the pathogens, is by using these. We also have ways to neutralize these free radicals. We have enzymes in our body, endogenous, meaning they're naturally occurring, they're there, that neutralize these free radicals. And they do this in that they prevent something else from being oxidized. They become oxidized themselves. And I want to go through this list because once in a while, these will pop up in this course. And I want you to remember that you saw them here, that they are antioxidant enzymes. All right, so superoxide dismutase, and remember superoxide anion was one of the free radicals. So we know this is the one that's taking care of that. Catalase, which will come up in an article we're going to talk about this week. Glutathione peroxidase and glutathione reductase. I don't know if these are the only ones, but they're certainly the most studied. Another term, remember I talked about oxidative damage a moment ago. Sometimes this term oxidative stress is used. And that's when we're producing more reactive oxygen species than we can handle. We can't detoxify them fast enough. They're building up too much. That leads to oxidative stress. And there are some ways to measure this. Finding letter G here. This is probably not an exhaustive list, but I want you to have some idea that free radicals, remember that's what we're talking about, free radicals and reactive oxygen species, they are involved in a wide variety of diseases. And if you look, many of these diseases are diseases associated with older age. So they'd be associated with the biology of aging. Right, so again, the damage over time can cause some problems. And I won't read these lists because you can read those faster than I can to try and tell them to you. Why do we know that free radicals are involved with aging? Well, there's a multitude of evidence, but this is the kind of a sum of evidence. And I hope you won't shoot me or tell all the other professors that I got this information from Wikipedia. I got this information from Wikipedia, but this evidence is referenced and I've seen the references. Okay? So how long a species live and the rate at which they produce free radicals in reactive oxygen species, there's a correlation there. Now, correlation, remember, does not mean causation, but that's one point of evidence, right? It's just a point of evidence. There's also a correlation between the longevity of a species and the amount of oxidative damage that occurs. Well, that would make sense because the first point here was also true. Okay, so we haven't learned a whole lot more, but again, it's maybe some different additional evidence. There's a correlation between the longevity of species and the level of defenses against free radicals. Now we're adding some more meaningful evidence here. If they have less free radical defenses, they don't live as long, right? Well, we also know that free radical formation, the rate of free radical production increases with age. The rate of oxidative damage increases with age. And if you put these together, that's some evidence that they're involved with aging. And I think there's enough other substantial evidence that that I strongly recognize free radicals as being one of the main causes of aging. Not the only cause naturally, but a main cause. All right, so a moment ago we talked about antioxidant enzymes. Well, those are not the only antioxidants around. But the way that antioxidants typically work is they inhibit the oxidation of molecules by the free radicals or by the ROS because they get oxidized themselves, and then we have ways to get rid of them. Some of them will also get rid of the free radicals directly. This is not an exhaustive list of antioxidants. This is just a representative list. The hormone melatonin is an antioxidant. Vitamins C, A, and E are all antioxidants. And some people will take huge quantities of these because of that. We'll talk about that in a moment. That's selenium, a mineral, green tea and black tea. And I say antioxidants, these contain antioxidants. Berries contain antioxidants. Legumes, dark chocolate, lycopene, which is found in some plant foods, particularly tomatoes, and that's what gives tomatoes their red color. Grapes and wine, there's lots of antioxidants I believe in the skin of the grape, if I remember right. And so there are lots of antioxidants. This doesn't mean that if we take a bunch of antioxidants, we're more healthy because we have neutralized free radicals. I don't think we know enough to say that, but that's how they sell billions of dollars of antioxidants through advertising. But I don't really think that's supported at all. All right, our next cause of a common process of aging, and that's inflammation. And you may be saying, inflammation, why would that be associated with aging? Because it is. We often think of inflammation as a response to injury or infection. And indeed it is. Or it mentions here irritants as well. There are also some other things that will trigger inflammation. Some others are listed here: cigarette smoke, a weakened immune system, UV radiation, stress, a high glycemic diet. So this is a diet with let me put it this way, with a lot of simple sugars that get absorbed quickly. And so your blood sugar goes up really fast when you eat these foods. That's been associated with inflammation. A lack of sleep, oxidative stress that we just talked about with too many free radicals or ROS, cholesterol deposits in blood vessels, which interestingly also have a different association. And so there are a number of things that can cause inflammation. And inflammation can be localized, such as when we have a local infection or we've injured something, but it can also be systemic, where this inflammation occurs throughout the body. It doesn't mean that we're all puffy everywhere. Inflammation is really the release of factors into the blood that do a variety of things, and you can take another class to learn that. And And so that's really what we're kind of talking about with what we're doing here with aging. That inflammation may be acute, in other words, it's a short time and then it's going to go away, or it's chronic and it stays there. And the problem with aging is that too often there's this systemic, chronic inflammation. And I mentioned here chronic low-grade inflammation. It's associated with many chronic diseases. And again, here's a list. And some of these, again, you will associate with aging. Some are not associated with aging, but some of these are. Atherosclerosis, diabetes, and technically it's diabetes mellitus. Uh-oh, this just turned up. I don't know if you can see that, but my Microsoft Word just stopped responding. So I'm going to pause this until it is back online. Actually, looks like I paused the screen share rather than the video. I will learn this eventually here. Diabetes mellitus, that's more specifically what we're talking about. It can be more common in older age, like after age of 80, with some seemingly different causes than in people who get it when they're in their 40s or 50s. And it's associated more with inflammation at that point. And it doesn't tend to be quite as severe. And they're old enough that they don't have as many complications because those take a long time to build up. But certainly Alzheimer's disease, arthritis, and so forth. Here we go again. This time I'll get the right button. Anyway, cancers and so forth. So inflammation is associated with aging and with chronic disease. So signs of inflammation, this is more the local inflammation we were talking about: pain, heat, redness, swelling. And what happens is that a tissue that is damaged or it's infected or irritated or whatever releases molecules called cytokines. And I've defined those here as small proteins that attract inflammatory cells like macrophages, just so you know what they are. And these cytokines do a number of things. They increase the amount of blood flow to that area, and they increase the amount of leakage from the blood out into the tissues so that more of the proteins can get out there in order to help with the healing process, more of the cells that are needed for inflammation and so forth. Anyway, they all get out there. Plus, I didn't mention it here, but they also cause pain. So this is some basic information here. C-reactive protein is a protein that's commonly measured as a marker of inflammation. So how much C-reactive protein is there in the blood? Interestingly, when you have a high CRP level, and I haven't defined what that is, but there's a much greater risk of death. Right? So that's kind of important to remember. Inflammation, there's a greater risk of death. In addition, inflammation damages something called the endothelium. So all of your blood vessels are lined on the inside by a thin tissue, and we call that the endothelium. So it's the inner lining of blood vessels, and that can lead to something called endothelial dysfunction, which we will actually talk about as a separate common process of aging. And so endothelial dysfunction, and importantly, endothelial dysfunction is actually common to many chronic diseases. So it happens in things like diabetes. It can happen with high blood pressure, and as well as a number of other things. Well, inflammation with aging, the problem is with aging, there are more of these inflammatory cytokines circulating. I also found an interesting fact that if a senior is frail, it says frail seniors, I think that's what the article might have said. I would say elderly individuals. The more frail an individual was, they were more likely to have greater inflammation. So a strong correlation there. Why is this inflammation bad? I mean, other than it's associated with things, well, it's associated with more blood clotting activity, muscle weakness, fatigue, disability. So it's not something that we want, and it's something that should be treated. In general, inflammation is treated with NSAIDs like ibuprofen because they inhibit the inflammatory pathways. However, if an older individual does not know that they have this chronic low-level inflammation, and it's not something they check regularly at the doctor's office, they wouldn't know. And so they probably would not be taking anything. Right, the next common process of aging, advanced glycation end products, or simply age, advanced glycation end product. All right, so what is glycation? Glycation, let me back up just a little bit. We can add sugar molecules to other molecules in the same way that we have the phospholipid is a phosphate group on a lipid. You can have a glycolipid, you can have a glycoprotein, you have proteoglycans. You get the idea that we add sugars to other molecules all the time as part of their structure. And when we do that normally using an enzyme, and that's a normal process, that's referred to as a glycosylation. So we have glycosylated proteins and so forth. However, glycation is when that sugar is added non-enzymatically. In other words, it's just, for all intents and purposes, it kind of just floats by and sticks to this other molecule. Now you can imagine that probably doesn't happen too much if sugar levels are maintained at a reasonable level. So this is something that would probably be happening more with individuals who tend to have higher blood glucose levels. All right, and this glycation, it'll stick to another protein. Why is that a problem? Because that can actually cause the proteins to stick together. And now because they're stuck together, they won't work the way they're supposed to anymore. Well, we know as we grow older, we accumulate the amount of advanced glycation end products. In addition, to link this back earlier to another common process or mechanism, we know that these ages can cause endothelial dysfunction. All right, so now we're seeing links between ages and endothelial dysfunction, and we'll see that with free radicals, but we'll bind all of these things together. So even though we talk about them separately, they're really working together. Well, what causes advanced glycation end products? These are a few things. High glucose levels. Well, that one would make sense, right? Because there's more glucose there to bind. Foods cooked at a high temperature. So things like fried food in particular are dangerous. Now we're linking it again, inflammation. Why? I don't know, but when there's more inflammation, there's more formation of these ages. Our last common process we'll talk about in this lecture is atherosclerosis. Now, earlier we mentioned that arteriosclerosis, that's when calcium gets deposited in the arterial wall, they become stiff. Atherosclerosis is a type of arteriosclerosis, but there's some different steps here to having that formed. In general, this is the definition of atherosclerosis. It's when fatty plaques form in blood vessel walls. And you might have even heard about these before. Well, we know this is related to inflammation, and we'll talk about why in a moment, and that's because there's actually some damage that's going to be involved here. And it's generally caused by LDL. This is low density lipoprotein. Generally, that's what they refer to as the bad cholesterol. And when LDLs get built up in the arterial wall, macrophages, these are immune cells, white blood cells that will be in there, they start to accumulate, and that's where the fatty plaque gets its start. Okay? This is why we want to control our blood lipid or cholesterol levels. Now, HDL, high density lipoprotein, is the good cholesterol, and it actually helps to eliminate the LDL. The HDL actually doesn't have cholesterol in it. What it does is it goes around, picks up the cholesterol from all the LDL, and takes it back to the liver for processing. There are three basic components of an atherosclerotic plaque: the macrophages, so the white blood cells that we just talked about; cholesterol crystals, meaning they're no longer in solution, right? They've crystallized. And later in an atherosclerosis, when it becomes more advanced, there's also calcium deposits there. And that's why this is a subtype of arteriosclerosis. Atherosclerosis can appear for a long period of time. There's no outright symptoms of it. So somebody can be asymptomatic for decades until all of a sudden the atherosclerosis is closing off an artery so much that's in the heart that when they're climbing stairs, they're getting really short of breath, or their legs start to ache, it could be a variety of symptoms. In most areas of the body, it may not cause as much issue, but there are some places, of course, that are more important, like the brain and the heart. These atherosclerotic plaques can actually start to develop at a very early age. In a study of those who were killed in the Korean War, so this is in the 50s, they found these they found these atherosclerotic deposits in 19-year-olds. Now, granted, there's probably a lot heavier smoking rate at the time, and that might have contributed to it. But it does show they can start to form at a relatively early age and then develop over a long period of time. These are the basic steps. The LDLs get deposited in the endothelium, which, remember, was the inner lining of all of the blood vessel walls. The LDLs, again, we're linking this with other things now, get oxidized by free radicals or reactive oxygen species. So now they're damaged. Well, oxidized LDL is not good, and it can actually, in turn, damage that arterial wall. Well, now you've damaged something. When you damage something, you have an inflammation process. When you have inflammation, macrophages go there to clean up any of the damage. So that's where the macrophages come from. They get called in by the cytokines that are sending out the signal because there's damage. Here's the problem. The macrophages can't get rid of the oxidized LDL. They can ingest it, but when they go to lyse it or get rid of it and break it down, they can't do that. And so these macrophages start to fill up with oxidized LDL and become what we call foam cells. So if you ever see this in the literature, that's what foam cells are. They're these macrophages that have been filled up with all this undigested, oxidized LDL. And remember, LDL, lipoprotein, the cholesterol, this is a lipid. And so when we talk about fatty streaks or a fatty deposit being part of atherosclerosis, that's it. Well, now the artery is becoming inflamed, right? It starts to swell. And as part of this, and I don't have the steps of why this happens, but I know of individuals that have studied this, the smooth muscle cells that are surrounding that artery so they can constrict and dilate, they begin to get bigger and they proliferate. And they accumulate calcium. So now we have the calcium hard part of that plaque, right? Well, now because of the buildup of these smooth muscle cells, because of the inflammation, because of these foam cells, the artery starts to shrink. And it's not equal, right? It's forming on one side and it's moving over and blocking everything off. And blood flow gets reduced. And if it's reduced enough, it can cause a heart attack or myocardial infarction, or it could cause a stroke. Or the plaque could rupture, and then it forms what we call a thrombus, and that can float around and get stuck in a smaller blood vessel and block blood flow into somewhere else, again, causing other problems. So how do we treat atherosclerosis? Well, or typically high cholesterol levels. There's a class of drug called statins, and they've been used now for several decades. There are some side effects that have to be monitored, but the statins can be really effective at reducing cholesterol synthesis in the body. Most of the cholesterol in the body does not come from the diet. It's because we make it naturally in the liver. And statins stop that, and they're pretty effective at helping to slow down this whole process. And now the process with this whole blocked artery is that not because blood can't go through, but because it slows down blood flow. And when you slow down blood flow, a clot can form. And so individuals that they know have advanced atherosclerosis and they're not going in for surgery yet may take an aspirin a day because it can block the clotting process. And we'll pick up from that next week when we talk about common processes of aging, part 2.